This is a small video explaining to you why I think we're in big trouble. This is a solar influx graph, which shows you the solar energy that the Earth was receiving from 1674 to 2011. As you can see, in 1676 is when we were in the last major mini ice age. And you can see it's right down here. And it stopped about 1706. And as you can see, the Pilgrims, the reason they had such a hard time here is because that was during the 1600s. 1621 was when the Pilgrims. Gives you an idea why it was very hard for them to not grow anything. More graphs of solar cycles. As you can see, they go up and they go down. They go up and they go down. Here's a famous picture towards the end of the last mini ice age. A lot of people take for granted. As you can see, they're crossing the Delaware, and those are icebergs in the river. You don't see very many icebergs in the river nowadays, and you haven't seen them since the 1700s, but that was when the last ice age ended, and no one seems to talk about that stuff. Here's some more effects from the last ice age. Millions of people perished from the cold triggers, chain reaction across civilization, disrupted society, reshaped the world. New York Harbor froze for 5 weeks, allowing people to walk from Manhattan to Staten Island. Summer storms decimated Spanish Armada. Famines drove France masses to Paris, demanding affordable bread, fueling chaos, which led to the French Revolution. Mass hysteria took root. Witch hunts became common practice as many women were burned alive at the stake. George Washington's victory in the Battle of Trenton can also be attributed to the Ice Age. Here's some more information. A little Ice Age. In 1595, glaciers advanced, drained river, causing flooding of the band with 70 deaths. Of course, the populations were much smaller back then, so it probably would have been more than 70 if it was today. 1600 through 1610, advances by Chalmex French glaciers caused massive floods, which destroyed 3 villages and severely damaged a 4th. One village had stood since the 1200s. 1670s to 80, which was when the maximum advances of the glacier, that's when it started slowing down, was the 1670s and 80s. The glaciers in the Alps, noticeable decline in human population by this time as areas close to glaciers. 1695 to 1709, ice glaciers advances, dramatically destroying farms. 1710 to 1735, a glacier Norrie was advancing at a rate of 100 meters per year for 25 years. 1748 to 50, Norwegian glaciers achieved their historical maximum. So about 1750 is when it started to end. And that's when we pretty much stopped paying attention to the Ice Age. Here's another chart. It shows we have been observing sunspots for over 400 years, and the last one was the Maunder minimum. That's when we had almost no sunspots. Then, of course, there was the Dalton minimum, which was a smaller one where you had a few sunspots. And then, of course, there is nowadays where we've been living in modern society where there's been tons of sunspots and tons of sun activity. So, of course, we think this is what normal is, when actually, sometimes, this is normal. Here's an old historical photo towards the very end of the last ice age, which means it was still on the upward swing, which means it was warming. This was towards the end, and you can see rivers used to constantly freeze, and people used to go out on them all the time. We don't do that anymore because rivers don't freeze like this anymore because we're in a hot stage right now. Here's an old picture, because they didn't have photos back then, of the rivers in England freezing over. Here's another old painting. And another river painting. Old maps of California, but again, this is towards the very end of the Ice Age, so this is when it started warming. Like I said, you can see big lakes, big Tulare Lake there, lakes in Mojave. The Mojave Desert used to be a full lake here. So yeah, it was different. A lot more different. But again, this is towards the end. There's probably much more water in the 1600s during the actual beginning of the mini Ice Age. Here's an old map of California, and as you can see, it used to be called Lake County, California. There's Tulare Lake right there, and then here's the Bakersfield area down in here. But again, look what it was called. Lake County, California. Lake County. That explains to you that this was all water in here. Especially during the flood time, it was probably completely full of water. Again, Lake County, California. Here's a much older map of California. Probably not to scale or anything like that, but again, if you zoom in, you can see there's Tulare Lake. There's Bakersfield right there. Two big giant lakes in Bakersfield. Here's a river. Where's that river at? That river don't exist anymore, but yet there it is, heading up north to Sacramento. And as you can see, this is all swampland. You can see it's swampland right in here. It's my theory, but I don't actually have any proof. But if you look at these really, really old maps from the 1600s, when explorers were exploring the California coast, you can see there's California. And you're asking yourself, why is it separate? Well, my feeling is this. This is Baja California right here. And then when they came up here to San Francisco, they probably thought this big giant lake inside Central California with a few little islands in between, they just assumed that it was one big giant crevice in between California and the United States, not sailing all the way through and realizing there was Los Angeles right in here. That's my opinion as to why you see these old maps where California is completely a separate entity. These are maps from the 1600s when the Ice Age was at its height, and I think the flooding of the Central Valley was huge. I bet you the whole Central Valley was filled with water. And like I said, the explorers that came down here in the Baja, Mexico probably stopped, came all the way down here, and went all the way up here to San Francisco, sailed all the way in the Central Valley, and they just said, oh, well, let's turn around. We don't have any more to explore. And that's why they thought there was all one big giant line right here. There's another older map of California. Again, as you see, separate from the United States. Completely separate. And again, ask yourself, why was it separate for? Why would they assume that it was separate? What would make them think that? And like I said, my theory is they sail up here, see this big long ocean, and go up here, and sail in through the whole of the Central Valley, and there were all these little islands in the Central Valley that were slightly above. That's my guess. Again, I don't have no proof because this is long before there was any kind of civilization other than the Indians here. This is the early explorers mapping California. So this is my theory, and I'll show you in a second. This is what I think happened. I think these early 1600 explorers came up through here. And like I said, as you can see, there's only 2 islands here. But you see in the other pictures, there's multiple islands. But I think they came up here, stopped up in here, came back down, went around all up in here, and then came up into San Francisco. And I think this whole area was full of water, or at least a good enough marshland where they could sail in it. Especially during if it was a good flood season. But I think this whole Central Valley was flooded with water in the 1600s. So like I said, I think they came up here and turned maybe back around, came up here, went into San Francisco Bay and saw this big lake in here and just assumed it was naturally went all the way down. Again, I don't have any proof of this yet, but sure would make much more sense. Probably showed you these old photos, and you can see what the Central Valley used to look like during the 1850s. See all the flooding. And again, 1850s is towards the end of the last ice age, so it was starting to warm, and we're getting a lot less water and a lot less flooding. But you can see how much water was in here, and then all these marshlands. Here's another interesting story I saw. It says, the settlers realized homes that they survived had something in common. They were built on spots where Native Americans originally put down settlements. The native stories spoke of the Sacramento Valley as an inland sea. For centuries they'd seen the valley filled with water. And the Nevada City Democrat reported that the Indians living in the vicinity area left their adobes a week or more ago for foothills, predicting an upcoming unprecedented overflow. So once again, they were built where the cities were built where they had their original settlements, and the native stories spoke of Sacramento Valley as an inland sea. They seen the valley filled with water, and the Nevada, like I said, they've seen the valley filled with water.